Good evening and welcome to Hidden Images at Haus der Kulturen der Welt. In between, contributions of migrants towards a new relationship between art and society is the title of our today's panel, and we are happy that Huang Yongping, Wolfgang Knapp, and Hou Hanru followed our invitation to discuss this topic that has been and is key to the work of University of the Arts and Haus der Kulturen der Welt and beyond. Welcome. When does intercultural communication fail? When can it succeed? What strategies of translation do cultural protagonists develop in the in-between? These and other questions will be addressed on the panel today. Before we start, I would like to thank the UDK for the year-long cooperation, and especially Zbigniew Werli and Andreas Schmidt, who are the curators of the series Hidden Images. They will now introduce to you the speakers. Please, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome from Andreas Schmidt and me, Zbigniew Werli, who are curating the series Hidden Images on the situation of arts in China. The Chinese name is 三点头诗中国艺术现状. And especially again a welcome to our guest, who Kirsten already presented, Hou Hanru, art critic, curator, and writer who is living in between San Francisco, Paris, and Rome. And Huang Yongping, an artist from Paris, and Wolfgang Knapp from the Institute for Art in Context from UDK Berlin, and also Gisela Reinhold, who will translate the Chinese of Huang Yongping. And 非常欢迎你们的到来. We are very happy to have you here. And yes, and I have to say that Sarat Maharaj, he cannot be here. And we are very happy that Wolfgang Knapp kindly agreed to step in at a very short notice. And yes, after the wonderful presentation of Huang Yongping yesterday at the University of Arts in Berlin, where we had the chance to get some insights in his artistic practice, today we will focus on the discussion topic of the in-between, of the intercultural, and of the migration. All of our today's guests are deeply involved in these questions due to their personal biographies, which unfold in the in-between, but also due to their activities as cultural mediators in between places, cultures, traditions, and also in between disciplines. Huang Yongping described his own artistic practice in the 90s as hitting the West with the East and the East with the West. And in this context, I would like to recollect one of Huang Yongping's best-known works from 1987, where he washed two books, The History of Chinese Painting and The History of Modern Western Painting, for 2 minutes in a washing machine. Concerning his works that employ the washing of books, which he still practiced after his immigration to France, I would like to quote Huang Yongping: "I do not cleanse culture, I make it dirty." With this remark, I would like to open today's discussion and pass the word to Andreas Schmidt, who will introduce now our guests and more in detail. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome to all who are here today. I will make it very short because I'm also looking forward to hearing all our guests talking and debating. And I really make a very short introduction of our guests. Huang Yongping, I begin with the artists and also the Chinese guests. Huang Yongping was born in Xiamen in Fujian province. He's one of the most well-known and highly regarded international and national artists from China. He studied painting. He began at the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts, studying painting. And in 1986, he found the Xiamen Dada group, which disturbed the Chinese art world as well as the officials and the Chinese public with their provocative and unexpected activities. In May 1989, he was invited to take part in the exhibition Magiciens de la Terre in Paris. After June 4th, he decided to stay in Paris. Since then, he has been living and working in Paris, and he is featured in the world's most prominent venues. He took part in numerous exhibitions. I just mentioned the Shanghai Biennial in 2000, and especially before the Venice Biennial 1999, where he represented France. Through his way of reflective artwork, he challenges our customs of perception as well as our habits of thinking. Welcome. And now Hou Hanru. He's a prolific writer and curator. He received degrees from the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing in the 80s. He took part in the preparation and making of the famous exhibition China Avant-Garde, held in Beijing in February 1989. In 1990s, when times got very rough and hard in China, he moved to Paris. He moved to Paris, and he lived there for 16 years. During that time, he worked as a multiplicand for the presence of contemporary Chinese art in Europe. He also curated many exhibitions, partly with Chinese artists, partly with artists from various countries, including Chinese artists. From 2006 until recently, he worked at the San Francisco Art Institute as director of exhibitions and chair of exhibition and museum studies. At the moment, he's on his way to start a new career at the Maxi in Rome. It starts in November 2013. Hou Hanru has also created more than 100 exhibitions. I just mentioned two very important for me. It was Cities on the Move, together with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, which ran from 1997 until 2000. And 2003, as a part of the Venice Biennial, he curated the Zone of Urgency. This summer, the last thing he curated was the 5th Auckland Triennial in New Zealand. Thank you very much for being here. And Wolfgang Knapp, who I'm very happy that he is here, because it was just a very short time that Sarat Maharaj told us that he could not come due to illness of his father. He had to go to India. So that you are really helping us a lot with taking part in this panel discussion. He's working as a professor for visual communication in the Institute of Art in Context, here at the UDK. He studies social sciences, art and visual communication, is member of also numerous committees at the UDK, and had spent several times as a professor in China, but not only in China, around the world, let's say. And he initiated various international projects, and he himself took part in many different exhibitions and projects. So I thank you very much for being here, and please, let's start the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Give me the possibility to speak here. And of course I can't replace Sarat Maharaj, but I try my very best to figure out my point of view. I just came back from China, and let's go fast forward. We didn't know each other before, but we met hardly 20 years ago by discussing in the middle of the 90s if it might be sense to create an exile museum for Chinese contemporary art outside of China. We need not to realize it because artists have more and more access on the market. So let's go to the keywords. Migration. Very often migration is not anymore used as the word migration. It's combined with other categories. We have the aspect of transmigration. That means that artists or others go temporarily from one point to another, being sure in the moment of arriving that they will leave after a certain period of time. We have a pendulum migration. This is a form of presence in two places regularly. For instance, you have two working bureaus, one in Paris, one in Rome, and you go back and forth, you commute. Artists very often live and work in two different places or two different countries. So this is a specific aspect of cultural migration as a positive, self-challenging attitude, perhaps a self-qualification attitude in contemporary art market. Specifically in Europe, we have some aspects of so-called pre-socialist migration, war-based migration, and post-socialist migration. So if big contexts of political systems collapse, there are migration movements beyond cultural strategies. So there are always moments of pushed migration and pull aspects of migration, decision-making processes, where to go. This might be an interesting issue to discuss, how artists decide to migrate. We know that very few artists of international reputation did decide to go to Albania or to Greece or to Azerbaijan. So mostly the big European and North Hemispheric countries are the focus of migrating attitudes. You have to separate migration from nomadic way of living, where the ethnologists and cultural anthropologists differ between horizontal and vertical migration, which means that you go from place to place regularly because of fertile soil or for other reasons, or you go vertical, like we have it in the European Alps, to go to higher levels with the cattle in summer and lower. So these are the nomadic attitude becomes interesting in the 90s, artists as nomadic people. We just had a discussion 10 years ago on this nomadic strategy of artists of temporarily presence in certain So another subcategory of migration might be the aspect of being fugitive or displaced person in cultural, political conflicts. Reasons to migrate could be very different. It could be social, economic ones. It could be patterns of discrimination on sexual, religious, language-based level. If you look, for instance, to the history of the Soviet Union and Russia, there was in the beginning the debate between feudalism, monarchy, capitalism and socialism, and more the new states are discussing race, language, territory, national identity. And there might be an aspect in this migration debate to think about renationalization, retribalization, the rediscovering of ethnicity to prove the artistic position. So aspects of self-discrimination, of self-stigmatization could be a pattern to have access beyond migration context to international art market. So the question might be, we can to discuss later, is how artists change personally, individually, in context of migration, and what influence we could figure out on their artwork. Did the artwork change, or is the artwork a certain kind of reliable continuity in the discontinuity of life and place? I shift for a short moment to my professional background. I teach since a couple of years in University of the Arts in Berlin. Within these 60 programs in this school, there is one program. It's a postgrad program for all visual artists, and they are working in interdisciplinary projects. And one place where I teach more is image production in science, art, and media. The challenging work in this postgrad program is that the postgraduate students are from 28 to 30, and there is no age limit on one hand. And among these 80 students we have in this 2 or 3 year program, they're coming actually from 42 countries. So we had situations like in the 90s that I started a seminar with 8 Yugoslavian students in the group, and after 1 year, or 2 years, there were no Yugoslavian students, but the same people are sitting in front of me, but there were now Serbs, Croats, Slovenians, Albanians, Dalmatians, and so on. So the biography changes by political change. We had students that were Czech. There was a couple, and after the separation of Czechoslovakia in Slovakia and Czech, they were foreigners in the same couple. So he has to introduce his wife as a foreigner because she is now Slovak. So biography sometimes changes by changing passport, but on the other hand, artwork don't have passports. So we have to make a difference between national contributions, national attitudes, nationalization strategies, which I still have at the Biennale in Venice, and the work of self-definition of the artist at the moment. I will not show slides. I will give some short categories, some short hints on projects we did, because there are some intercultural collaboration projects in South Africa or in Iran. You can't do this in 1 minute or 2 minutes without being rude and without crossing, from my point of view, the borders of respect and responsibility as an artist or a curator. Well, if you look to the aspect of intercultural exchange or communication, which was one of the keywords of the invitation card you all have, we could think about who is trying to adopt this discussion. We have this in German political context of this so-called intercultural dialogue concept by government, which means how to integrate or how to calm down the debate on European Islamic citizens. Or it's a debate on inter-religious communication, but very often it's not a self-enlightenment process, let me say this very clear. It's more a calming strategy that is not too much noise around. There are some very perhaps romantic positions like Mohammed Munir was figuring out. The more we share, the more we have. We can discuss this if this sharing moment is a strategy to collaborate. Intercultural discourse might be open to the debate of transcultural discourses because there is a inherent conservatism of value in this discussion. Why? Insisting on cultural differences, if you look to the debate on multicultural projects, very often the basement is you must be different. You have no chance to be integrated. We want you to be different. So there is a hierarchy a discourse in this multiculturalism, which is very often focused on the aspect of tolerance, which is a certain kind of cultural dominance. I decide that I can be tolerant towards you. This is a description of a certain kind of cultural arrogance based on hierarchy, based on cultural dominance. You need not look to Gramsci or Laclau or Chantal Mouffe at that point. The question is, who am I that I can say I'm tolerant to you? I accept how you are, who I am. I'm not allowed to do this. That's forbidden by a certain kind of respect under colleagues. The point is interesting on the aspect of debating how civilization or cultures come together. We have this debate on cultural contact, cultural conflict, a certain sidestep, please allow me this, on the debate on clash of civilization, the Huntington discussion, which was translated in German, Kampf der Kulturen. Surprisingly, this title, because in 1936 there was a book published with the same title, Kampf der Kulturen. It was re-edited in 1956, and oh wonder, how does it happen in 1998? The title is again Kampf der Kulturen. That's a big difference, that clash of civilization. So we have to look to the historical management of the cultural discourse to defend this attitude of cultural supremacy. Why is it that case? That's only a question I have, this fight for cultural supremacy, why it's not possible to have this discussion on the same level. If you look to, for exchange, in university context, for exchange programs in Erasmus, it's very easy to get students to US or to Barcelona or to London, but try to motivate students to go to Hungary or to Vilnius or to other places. So there is a clear pre-selective perfection in selecting migration targets for artistic, for the own artistic career. That's not by accident. There is a certain kind of pre-selection. You decide where you go, except situations where you are political or a social fugitive, in a social fugitive context, and you have no time to decide. By step, the international art centers are the main focuses of migration context. If you look to the people, another sidekick, who is migrating, temporarily or permanent, who are sitting in the planes, airplanes, on the ships and the boats, we have to acknowledge that only 5 to 8% of the world population take part in this global move. And the rest never moves away from the place. So it's a very small minority of 5% moving on. Who is it? Who is the neighborship and the crowd around the artist who is going to move on that level? Let me give you a short list of these professions who are involved in this kind of migrating context. Diplomats, fugitives, business people, secret services, journalists, military people, pilgrims, tourists, scientists, drug dealers, weapon dealers, sex slavery, and so on. This is a crowd we have to accept when we discuss these migration moments of cultural elites. It's a quite challenging neighborhood for artists, for instance. For not being unpolite, I have to acknowledge that 2 questions were given to us, and the one is, where does intercultural communication fail? When can it succeed? And what strategies of translation do cultural protagonists develop in between? Let me give a short critical comment to the first question. If we discuss for the space in between failure and success, so we have accepted already that there is a third beyond either or. Unfortunately, the question is polarizing between either or. So we have to focus the gap. What is the gap between these either or? And anyhow, I try to answer some aspects when intercultural exchange and interaction might fail. It's fighting for dominance and supremacy. It's the category of tolerance, the misuse of the category of tolerance are already used. It's a too romantic and too strict focus on tradition. I only recommend to look for Eric Hobsbawm and his wonderful text from the 80s about the inventions of tradition. That's very important. Who invented the traditions we are relying on? There's always a historical point when a tradition was invented for a certain purpose. It doesn't happen by accident. And, and what might be successful approaches or attitudes. I don't rely on the category of strategy. That's, for me, inappropriate in that context. And on appellation didactics, like they call it in education theory. The question is how to slow down speed of interaction. How is it possible to cultivate diversity by non-exclusive strategies? You must be different because I need this. The foreigner as artist, as entertainer, as cook, as singer, but not as a neighbor, for instance, or somebody who's looking for a job. How respect is possible, and which kind of responsibility must be integrated in the artistic self-understanding of today. I think we have to cross the border of being only responsible for self-marketing, self-branding, and art practice. The question is which categories and levels of responsibility are to be integrated in the self-understanding of, let's say, from Renaissance period, the genius self as an artist, or the artist in contemporary day in migration contexts. So before artistic intervention, self-exposure must be could be an interesting approach, and not to intervene wherever you start. You start with an intervention and neglecting the context in which you work. There was an exhibition 10 years ago in Haus der Kulturen, Heimat, Kunst. There was a little gap between Heimat and Kunst, home and art. And the idea was if art could be a future home, though the way back is not possible. If you look to the philosopher of Bloch or others, time? Okay, two more minutes, this will be possible. The point is, where are the spaces artists could act in future without the concept that artists are the genius troubleshooters who solve all problems. This is a moment that doesn't work. The artist as prophecy, the artist as therapist, as social engineer, as the rescue squadron of the world, I'm very doubtful and skeptic for that. And the second question is the question of space of action. So when you are on a borderline, normally you can act like you want. Some parts of your body are on this side or that side. The question might be, to whom belongs the border? I just give the last hint on Victor Turner and his discussion on liminality or liminal spaces, the place between acting and non-acting. So if we extend this moment, what we call in German, I don't know the English word unfortunately, Latenz. This is the moment between decision and non-decision, and between either or, even in the English writing, there is a little gap. Latent, yeah. This moment of latent between either and or. This might be the common third we could look for. Thank you for listening.
Before Yongping is going to talk about his work, again, I think really Wolfgang touched on some two very important questions. One is really the question of the relationship between migration and translation. And I think the second question also is extremely important for understanding the work of Yongping and many other artists, is the space of action, the in-between space. I think this is two really crucial questions that we touch on when we talk about the transition from post-colonial negotiation to globalization today. I think it's really essential. And I guess, from very early time already, Huang Yongping's work touched on those questions, even without being a migrant out of his country. And as he introduced yesterday, as an artist working with this Xiamen Dada project, which is already, which was situated in his hometown, but in the meantime, this action, actually, the effort to go beyond the conventional way of making art, the conventional understanding of the notion of art actually was already a very important effort of migrating from one cultural system to many other possibilities, which is not simply migrating from one to another, but it's about moving to different positions, targeting different moving targets, which is extremely interesting. And the way that he targeted, it's also a kind of guerrilla style of taking over the champ d'action, the field of action. So this is very important when you look at this diagram. That there's one really beautiful word there in Chinese. It's called 冷枪手, meaning sniper. So I think from the very beginning, there's the action of the migrant artist. It's a sniper positioning himself in a moving position to catch the moving target. I think this is extremely beautiful, and I actually insist on bringing this diagram back, which was a diagram that Yongping used to describe his work for the years between 1989 to 1999. Actually, the last 10 years also have seen the continuation of this project and strategy. I don't simply think it is a description, but it's really a project that describes how he positioned himself as a migrant artist to target migrating problematics of our world. So you can see the blue part written in Latin words, which is the cities. Well, his projects took place, and the Chinese words actually described the themes that he was dealing with in each of those places, starting from migration, history, art history, racism, colonialism, the self, reason, museum, audience, God, yeah, and fortune-telling, animal, sniper, mockery, East and West, time and space, Islam, food chain, conflict, ancient and modern, medication, Christianity, the century and yellow peril, Buddhism, borderline, exclusion, smuggling, and back to one very important thing, which is wash. As we mentioned many times today, that washing actually doesn't mean to render things cleaner. Instead, it's created a further confusion. The outcome is always dirtier than the original situation. So I guess, migrating related to the question of translation implies really important, one very important phenomena, which is transformation of meaning itself. Meaning that it's not only the meaning, the original interpretation of the word or the language has been transformed into something else, but also the position of the person who perceive the meaning of the work also transformed. So, and that transformation actually created a very interesting new space of action in which actions are transforming the displays, and this place itself is also being transformed into something else. So it's a kind of ongoing recycling of this very interesting tension between project strategy and outcome. So the second question actually Wolfgang actually mentioned, it's about when the failure of intercultural interpretation will happen, when the succeeding moment is actually happening. Actually, in this kind of situation, this distinction between failure and success probably doesn't make sense anymore. It's simply this tension that continues to produce possibilities of understanding the situation. In the meantime, it also produced the impossibility of this understanding. I think from the very, very early time, Yongping came up with a very interesting interpretation of Hollenbach's idea of signifier. And he actually came up with this notion called the empty, completely empty signifier, meaning that creating an image, creating a artwork or a word, when you express yourself, it's not simply pointing to the meaning of a object in a stable way, but instead it's always pointing to the other side of the meaning, which is the impossibility of the meaning. That means the emptiness. So this is a very important kind of a philosophical position that Yongping's work, Yongping from really early time, he started already built into his way of thinking, his way of taking position. And that kind of negotiation with the dilemma of meaning, I think, is really very, very important here. And I guess this is a very brief introduction of, to maybe a further discussion on what we mentioned here as some questions. I guess Yongping, maybe you can start talking about the few recent works that really specifically dealing with this new space of action, which is the geopolitical situation today, which is extremely urgent to be talked about. But in the meantime, this talking, it's about negotiating, but without really coming up with any clear answer to that.
He would like to talk from here, and then somebody helps him with the slides. Could you do that?
这个因为昨天在那个美术学院已经就说了，也换了很多的片子，但是我想这个今天我还是要换几张，为什么呢？因为艺术家的工作呢，主要是因为他来因为通过他的工作来说话，因为我毕竟不是个搞理论的，是吧？所以不能只是空谈。
Okay, I'm trying to do this one here, and I hope you can help with the slides. And you know that yesterday we already had a talk at the University of Fine Arts in Berlin, and yesterday I presented very many slides, and today I want to do something different. So that's why I'm going to sit here, because I think I don't want to repeat what I did yesterday, and also I think the work of an artist is his work. I mean, he speaks through his words, and he's not a theoretician.
对。然后这个我们看到这个是07年的，就是在美国做的，就是关于这个罗马斗兽场跟那个五角大楼。
And what we can see here is a work that I did in the United States, and you can see at the Colosseum in Rome and the Pentagon. It's a work that is on these two topics.
对，因为这两个形象，在我看来，一个是代表一个比较早的一个帝国，一个是现在的一个新的帝国。
And I took these two buildings because they represent two empires, one which is from very early times and one which is an empire that is still existing, a modern empire.
当然这个作品中间有很多的植物，这个意思就是说，这个其实我们也知道，这个历史上这个罗马斗兽场曾经是因为没人照理，后来长了无数的植物，然后损坏了很多。这个就是说我在表达说，一个就是说，好像自然的力量可能比人的力量会更大。这个就是。
And I put very many plants in these two objects, and you know that the Colosseum has become a ruin now, and I think it's because the forces of nature might be much stronger than the forces mankind can have.
对，然后我们来看下一章。下一章呢是这个，就是根据题目，这个可以看到，这个其实是本拉登的，就是在去年就是被抓的时候呢，就是这个他住的地方，这个地方呢，就是说，其实这个地方现在已经清理掉了，已经是可能去年已经清理掉。为什么？因为这个地点变为很敏感，所以这个作品呢，就 等于说也是刚才看的那两个作品的一个原系。
Okay, and here we can see the place Bin Laden lived in, where he was captured and shot last year, and that's a very sensitive place, of course, and as you know, it has been torn down by now.
对，这也提出说一个，其实可能自然它会有一种办法来解决这个人类的这个很多的这个争论不了的问题，其实是对自然来说是很简单的，它可能长满草以后，这个地方也就失去了它的意义。
And this is also to tell you that maybe nature has its own way, a very forceful way to kind of end all the debates that mankind is engaged in. So you see the grass is growing very, very quickly, and there's lots of grass. It's covering everything that mankind has been debating about.
对，那这个作品是去年这个是建议给这个马赛，就是欧洲文化中心的这个欧洲文化的这个文化年这个一个计划。当时呢是为了一个在Aix-en-Provence的这个市政府的一个大这个院子啊，这个尺寸是根据这个院子的大小来设计的。但是当这个作品到最后呢，这个市政府他们觉得这个不可能，这个作品放在那里，为什么？因为这个涉及到这个他们的表态问题，当然他们是比较偏右啊，然后这个作品就找不到一个地方可以展览，因为这个市政府放不下，后来他们想放在一个这个 Théâtre de Centre Théâtre， 就是在 Aix-en-Provence 也是一个很重要的一个地点。后来他们说这个好像也不行。最后呢，现在我们看到的这个是在一个私人的一个院子里面，所以私人院子就没有问题，所以可以展览啊。但是因为这个，我就觉得这个也是一个反映出一个我们现在有一些问题，就是我们害怕碰到一些我们觉得有一些事情我们没办法处理，特别是在政治上。但是艺术家，我想可以超越这个界限，我们可以谈一点东西。
Okay, this was a device. This was created for Marseille. You know that Marseille has been the cultural city of Europe in this year, and it was supposed to be also put into a public space in Aix-en-Provence, which has also been in this program. But then it was to be very big in a public space. But then the government thought that it was too sensitive and they didn't agree to it. So finally the outcome was that we put it in the garden, in the yard of a private space. And this of course can tell you that if there's a problem, this is a topic that has very many fears that go with it, and in public life or in politic life, it could not be exhibited in the public space, but then art was somehow able to overcome these fears and put it in a private place and make it a work of art.
这个就昨天曾经在美术学院说过了，因为没有图像，所以今天补一个图像。但今天无疑的就是要说明的一个问题，就是说这个航空母舰呢，当然这个垃圾桶呢就是在法国的一个公园里面，他们也是用这种垃圾桶啊，现在装满了水。然后这个航空母舰呢，当然是一个就是说，也差不多同时中国有一个航空母舰下水啊。但是要说明一点呢，就是说当时中国向苏联买这个航空母舰呢，是作为就是那个赌场用的。所以是很便宜，但是后来呢，就转为军方在使用，后来就变为一个真正可以使用的一个航空母舰。
This is about an aircraft carrier that is put into a garbage can, and the story behind it is there was a big aircraft carrier that China bought from the Soviet Union. It was supposed to be an amusement park, actually, but casino. And then it was, but it's already in the waters now. It's in the sea now, and it hasn't become a casino finally, but it was used by the Marines, by the Marine.
然后最后一个就谈一个作品，这个作品呢其实是法国有一个计划，就是说这个他们做了一个集装箱，这个集装箱是可以展开的，然后有差不多7、8个艺术家参与这个集装箱的作品，但这个集装箱呢是可以移动的，从欧洲一直移到非洲啊，所以他们说是为了给孩子看的，给非洲孩子看，给欧洲的一些孩子看这个作品。然后呢，其实我这个作品的题目叫你好你好，其实呢我这个是根据这个，因为 这几年中国跟非洲的这个关系就变得很密切。一方面呢，在这里面开采了很多的地方，所以在这里我们可以看到这个作品，这个一个那个犀牛被破开，然后犀牛肚子里面放的是铬矿还有煤啊，因为这两个就是在非洲有一个大量的开采。但是同时呢，这个又对这个当地的一个自然环境有个破坏，因为有很多的黑犀牛面临着消逝，这个是，而且中国呢，就为什么用你好你好？因为在非洲，这个你好你好变成很普遍的，大家都会说，而且小孩也很喜欢说，因为很容易发音，这个是这样。
Okay, this project is called Ni Hao, and it's about a container. You see European children looking at the container, and it's a container that has been moved from Europe to Africa. And you also see that there is a rhinoceros, and it has in its belly, in its stomach, it has copper and coal, because you know that China has very close relations now with Africa, and that the copper mines are being exploited by the Chinese, and also the black rhino is going to be extincted very soon because the horns are very valuable and people want to sell them. So this is what this project, Ni Hao, of course, hello, what, like when Africans see Chinese, that's what they say, like Ni Hao. So this is the project's names. And I forgot to say, because I mean the Chinese are exploiting all these mines, these copper mines and stuff in Africa, so the Huanjing, the environment is being harmed in Africa.
然后这个我就简短的说一下，就是因为今天的这个谈话的这个题目，因为因为就1989年以后呢，因为我就离开了这个中国，而且是参加一位这个蛮香的阿黛尔，所以我觉得我这同时面临了两个，因为我突然变为一个职业的艺术家，同时呢我会变成一个移民啊，这两个是几乎是同时的啊，尽管我这个一直否认说我是个移民。
And because this is what we want to talk about today, like after 1989, when I left China for France, because of the exposition Magicien de la Terre, I had two roles to play. In one place I was an artist, of course, and also at the same time I was an immigrant. So I had these two positions or these two roles.
这个艺术家移民或是移民艺术家，我觉得这个是一个很奇怪的组合。为什么？因为在我看来，就是艺术家如果是有创造性，或者说他其实是他经常是要离开原地啊，离开原地。所以艺术家呢是一个不动啊，是一个不动的移民啊，不动的移民。如果是他身体是移民的啊，但是呢实际上呢他是不动的。为什么？因为他可能是我就否认一种融合啊，或者说他想要保留一种差异，所以他就等于不移动，他就等于不动的这个移民啊，这个是一个矛盾。
I could be called an artistic immigrant or an immigrating artist, and it's because I mean when you create something, it actually means that you have to leave, but at the same time you stay put where you are. So your body might be leaving, but then there's also the concept of a difference, which means leaving. So it's very contradictory in a way. You stay put, and then you leave and create at the same time.
对，如果是一个艺术家，他的起步，他一开始，比方说他一开始是反艺术的，或者反文化的，是有点的反社会的。那如果这个艺术家他移民了，就我就想到一个德鲁斯的一个他引用了一个维里奥的一个问题，他说作为一个诗人呢，还是作为一个杀手赛姬啊，这个东西刚才我对。
And so, I mean, it's when an artist starts to walk, when he goes towards whatever the society or life or creation or whatever it is, I have to think of Deleuze, philosopher, who said, you cannot really say if you're the poet or if you're the assassin.
对，我把它改了一下，比方说，我就说是做一个艺术家呢，还是做一个恐怖分子而移民啊？这个当然，这个说这样，这是为什么说这个话？因为是我知道是法国曾经有一个艺术家，他叫做尼基的桑巴啊，尼基桑巴就是在60年代，他很激进，这个对，然后他向自己的用手枪打自己的作品。他说过一句话，他说为了避免成为一个恐怖分子，所以他成为一个艺术家啊，这个。
And I mean, you could also I could change this. Am I the poet? Am I the assassin? I could change it into am I the the artist or am I a terrorist? Because you know there has been Nicky Saint-Fall and he took a gun and shot his own works.
对，但我说，对
She actually said,
she said,
to avoid to be a terrorist, I decided to be an artist. This is why she shot on her work.
当然这句话我把它反过来说，我说为了避免成为一个艺术家，那我成为一个恐怖分子啊。但这个呢，就是说我们应该知道，就是把艺术跟恐怖分子这个谈并在一起谈是很危险的，啊，很危险的。这个特别是在今天。
He repeated that in order to avoid to be a terrorist, I became an artist. That's what Nicky Saint-Fall said. And so an artist and a terrorist, it's very dangerous to put these two notions together, especially in our times now.
那其实我是要说，就是在我们看来表面就毫不相干的东西，因为今天我们讨论全球的这个新帝国，或者全球的市场，或者全球的恐怖分子，或者全球的移民，或者全球当代艺术。我觉得它都具有一些某些相似，就是这个是什么相似呢？就是一个偶然性，还有一个流动性，还有它的灵活性。
So when we are talking about migration today, I mean, we have all these notions of new empires, of new markets, of new art, and so on. And they all have something in common. There is random that they have in common. 灵活性就是 flexibility， 还有一个第三个，一个偶然性，一个灵活性，还有一个第三个，他们
就是不可意料啊，不可意料。
Yeah, something unexpected.
这个其实刚才这个他也说了，就是说了一些这个，因为这个是我们在互相没有交流的情况下，这个互相拟出来一些稿子。好了，我的。
And that's also what Hou Hanru talked about, and we haven't really talked about this before.
I think what he said is actually we have here 3 different versions of talking about the question of migration. We all end up talking pretty different things and similar things at the same time, but we didn't have any preparation actually. We don't have any mutual exchange before, so we all end up having 3 different versions, which is also a very interesting mechanism that how this conversation happens.
Let's try the very best thing.
Yeah. Any questions? 有话筒吗？有没有 Do we have another mic?
There's one here you might
Yeah.
use.
Hello. This question is for Huang Yongping, the artist. How do you see the early works you've done in late 1980s? To me, it's more kind of an imagination of the West, and like while you were in China, you're kind of doing a lot of works about Western art or your imagination kind of about the Western culture. But after you immigrated to the West, a lot of your works are more about Chinese culture, and I don't know, how do you see this change?
你还在中国的时候，你可能考虑了西方的文化。你到西方的时候，那么你好像多关心中国的一些文化元素。你在这方面能不能谈谈？
这个其实没有那么激烈啊，就没有那么激烈。就是比如说这个，比如说这件作品就不能说是这个也是很混合的，因为在今天，在我看来，就是在今天，就很多事情是交叉在一起的，啊，就没有一个中国的问题或者是一个西方问题。你看经济上还有人的这个流动性，整个我觉得这个都被交织在一起。
Well, it's maybe not that. It's maybe not that direct because, like if you look at this work, it's not really like about China or about the West, because I think today it's very hard to say this is China and there's the West on the other side. Everything, no matter if it's economics or the way people move, everything seems to be entangled and everything seems to be intertwined.
I would like to... Is this working? Yeah. To give everyone, this is the crucial point you figure out. I could speak with my two colleagues because they are French artists and French curators. And you focus and you retribalize and you say you're Chinese. So, is there a parallel identity concept or not? If you look to the discourse, how the integration attitudes are differing in the cultures, what we discussed yesterday evening. In England, the most difficult thing to discuss is color. In France, to participate in the local culture is language and culture. And in Germany, it's blood. So there is no other country who is always asking on the he's a migrating with a migration background. If you ask an American artist with an Arabic name, are you Arabic? They say, what, Arabic? I'm American. So how can we get rid of this tribalization and stigmatization and say, well, what are you doing in your artwork contemporarily? We are bipolarizing this Chinese or European, this or that. But we are discussing what is the gap in between. Is there a chance to act as an artist beyond this ethnic and nationality debates, or are we always pushed back to these origins, roots, and all the debate like this? That's what is the focus of the invention of tradition. And there are also traditional patterns in discussing contemporary art. The first is gender, race, ethnic, and so on. And then if you have a lot of time, we look what the artist did indeed. And I think we should focus to the artwork and say, well, what do you see? So you have a bipolar focus. You say, okay, I filter European or not. And this is a too simple pattern. Sorry for talking.
I think it's really interesting that now I'm living in America, potentially coming back to Europe. I just coming back to Europe because this is really, Europe is like my home. Because I feel that, being in America, I feel actually increasingly Europe is my home. Maybe Paris is my home, because there is a fundamental difference, which is not only the racial community issue, this is one thing, but also the economic and political system. For example, the understanding of the social position of cultural production, it's totally different. In the American context, it's so simple and so easy, so natural that a artwork is a commodity. In an art institution, it's an entertainment institution. While in Europe, it's still a huge debate that an artwork should not be, like in the French way, a marchandise, right? And a cultural institution should be public funded and publicly funded through the government as an agent, and et cetera, et cetera. So this very interesting kind of difference actually made me understand what is inscribed on the identity of an artist, for whom you are making what. So that it's something really interesting. And an American artist actually one day told me, I can easily tell what is a European artwork, which is something that is not made for the galleries. Sometimes. Yeah, very often. Yeah. Of course, I'm kind of simplifying this distinction, but psychologically, there's an interesting difference in that. And these two systems we all know that are facing different kind of crisis. And what's the next step? And that's actually the task we are trying to deal with. Somehow, maybe that would make up our next part of our identities.
Which is beyond national.
It is beyond the public funding and private funding. That's so simple.
这个因为我在法国时间很长，但是其实我的这个法文是说的不好，而且我是特别害怕 这个在法国的这个电视啊，或者就是这个新闻这个记者的这种采访，这个而且在法国的艺术界，他也有时候搞不清楚，有时候把我当成中国艺术家，经常啊，一会儿说是法国艺术家。但是这个关于语言这个问题呢，比方说我如果旅行，我到这个美国或者到其他，比如很简单，我就前不久我才到德国，为了一个计划，他们请了一个法文的一个翻译啊，他们带了一个字典，法文字典，这个很厚，这个对我来说，当然对我来说是很困难的。这个我觉得这个都是各种各样的看法。是吧？各种各样的看法，其实我是游离在这个里面。我觉得艺术家看作品，比如说如果你可能看了个名字，你觉得啊，这个可能是个中国人，是吧？但如果是不看名字，你看作品，是不是可以猜到一点说啊，他就是中国人？因为专门是中国人才会做这种东西。所以我觉得不见得，是吧？有一些作品根本就看不出来是什么人做的，是吧？
I've been living in France for a long time, and my French is not very good, so I'm always very afraid to meet with the press or meet with journalists or have interviews on TV because of the language problem. And I mean, in France, it's the same question. To them, am I a Chinese artist? Am I a French artist? Both happen. Sometimes they take me for a French artist, sometimes they take me for a Chinese artist. And in the US, it seems to be so much easier because, I don't know, when I came to Germany, they asked a French interpreter who brought a very thick dictionary to help me with the language. But I think as an artist, I mean, you should just look at the work. And if you look at some people look at the name and then they kind of think, okay, this must be a Chinese artist. But there's some works of art, you look at them, and then there's no way of telling that this has been done by a Chinese artist.
We have to look historically. I think it was in the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, when nation and biography become stronger in interpretation context of artwork. So we have this biographical attitude as a focus of interpretation. From my point of view, most of the artworks, the biography of the artist is totally unimportant. There is another focus. And if we try to squeeze always this moment of biography and nation and ethnic context, there's a certain kind of reductionism in the perception of artwork. He gives some good examples of transformation of the self-interpretation of an artist. One is coming from military contexts, and the other from poverty context, especially in Europe, the sniper and the smuggler. Both have their origin in subcultural moments, and you must be very cunning and very inventive, because as a sniper and as a smuggler, you can't repeat the same strategy 2 times. And this is quite interesting, how artists could be on this level of smuggling protagonists to implement unaccepted ideas step by step through the artist. And if we try to trap them again and again and again by labeling nation and race and gender and all that stuff, we could focus the same idea by, is being gay or be vegetarian crucial to interpret an artwork? Here we will say, of course not, especially on the level of vegetarian. Religion might be a category, but it's not a ritual, it's not a principle. And the question is, as already Odo Marquardt said, how can we say goodbye to principles of interpretation? And this could be the place to start with it.
Personal experience because like once you go to a new environment that's not the same as your culture, you become kind of like the other, and then you might want to look back into where you come from to find like a position for you in that society, kind of. I don't know, I'm more interested in this kind of internal change or evolution, I don't know.
这个没关系，这个是这样，我就觉得艺术家有一个很特殊的这也是今天的社会这个赋予它一个很特殊性。 这个因为他可以做很多很多事情是别的领域不能做的，但是就是很多人没有认识到这个给他的这个权利啊，这个我这样说呢，是因为比方说这个我们在社会上，我们说啊，这个出现问题，人家说啊，这个是个艺术家，所以不可理解，艺术家做的事情不可理解，然后又说啊，这个人是中国来的，那更不可理解。为什么？因为在西方，就是中国是一个不可理解的一个黑洞，然后艺术家也是个黑洞，所以两个黑洞放在一起，所以有很多的优势。但是我不是说啊，这个没关系，不是说优势又怎么样，就是说它有这个可能性，这个可能性主要是你要认识到，仅此而已。
Okay, an artist is a very special thing also in relation to society because he can do things that other people in other domains and other positions cannot do. And this is also a kind of power that he has. And there's something in the society now that people think, okay, this is a piece of art, so we cannot understand it. And then people say, okay, this is from an artist who comes from China, so we cannot understand it at all because a work of art or art is like a black hole, and China is another black hole. So if you put two black holes together, it's just not understandable at all. This is something we just have to accept.
我补充一下，就是我刚才用了一个词，就是权利，其实不好。为什么呢？因为其实艺术呢，就是跟权利是始终这个沾不上边的，就不能用这个词。我们应该找另外一个词。
Okay, I just used the word 权利 power, which is maybe not very appropriate together with art. So maybe we should find another word for power when we talk about art.
There was another question. Yande, could you pass the microphone to the two other speakers with the gray? Oh, she has a question. Yeah, okay. Do you have the mic?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I was wondering in terms of when you talk about the artist as a sniper, I think it's important to see the other side, the receptors and the cultural institutions that are giving artists the opportunity to show and what their attention and acceptance and intentions might be in that acceptance. And I think also from the talk yesterday, it was interesting to see when you showed in China as a younger artist that they were more subversive shows, and then after immigrating to Europe and having attention there, it seems like the opportunities back in China were more on a legitimate level at cultural institutions and less subversive than the early works. But I feel like there's this kind of cyclical, it's not about, East and West attention, but it also went back to China in terms of how your work was received.
这个我要先说一下，解释一下这个关于这个冷枪手，因为我们知道这个冷枪手是肯定后边有一个组织指派的。那我觉得这个也是，我觉得这个作为艺术来说，其实他需要有一个敌人，但是这个敌人呢不应该由政府来指定啊，这个某个政府啊，不管是哪个政府啊，这个我觉得这个定义要搞清楚。你这个就是说可能是个冷枪手，但是打一枪换一个地方啊，但是他这个整个的这个结构呢，就跟政府没关系，跟政治没关系，跟我们通常认为的这个敌我关系是没关系的。
Okay, first about the sniper. I mean, of course, there is an organization behind the sniper that sent him to do that. And if you talk about art, there has to be an enemy. But it doesn't have to be the government or any government who sends him. So this has to be, we have to be very clear about. Like when the artist is a sniper, he shoots and then he has a change of place, he goes to another place. But this doesn't really have to do anything with any government.
这个第二个问题，其实昨天也提到了， 提到这个问题，那就是当然都没有很好的回答。但我觉得这个问题为什么我不能直接的回答？为什么呢？这个我觉得这个里面有一些什么因素呢？一个因素呢是，首先这个艺术家啊，他年轻的时候他反叛，对他很激烈，是吧？这个但是他还要再往下活啊，是吧？他有20年、30年、40年、50年的这个时间往下活，他怎么弄？他不能一下子把自己杀掉，自杀。是吧？说这个绝对，我就是提出一个绝对的一个概念，就是一个彻底性，艺术的彻底性，我们应该怎么来考虑一个彻底性
And about what we talked about yesterday, that a young artist is very revolting or very, not revolting, very subversive. Yes, okay, but then he has to go on living. He cannot kill himself. He has to live for another 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So, but the thing is, he has to be truly sorrow. There has to be a sorrow in this. A radicality in what he's doing.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing, and also how much one can consider the radicality expressed by the artists have actually changed the institution itself over time. And so we are not facing the same kind of institution from the day when Duchamp put a ready-made in a museum to now an institution that's seemingly accepting almost everything. But there's an evolution of the notion of political correctness that has been integrated into the institution, and that has to be continuously be reminded and restructured and challenged as well. So I think working in an institution, even sometimes leading an institution, and also it's really what makes an institution interesting is different is how this institution manages to take the lead on this challenge, the kind of self-reflection and self-critique of the institution itself. So the institution doesn't represent the correctness as well. So in this negotiation between provocative ideas and the perception and the translation of this radicality, I think it changes the nature of the institution regularly. So this is why somehow we were mentioning that the translation of the work is a force of transformation. This transformation is really transforming the field of action. The institution is the field of action, a part of this field of action.
Could you, it's a question to you both, my colleagues. Could you give some example or hint of these moments of transformation? If we go back to the category of smuggling, that could be the question, what is smuggled in the context of artistic practice? I'm curious about this because we just had a conference in Vilnius on the debate on migrating academies with the thesis that not the artists have to migrate, the academies have to migrate too. They have to move as an institution to other places to be on the road. So you could have the attitude in the context of a road, academic in the context of a road movie. So if the fashionable and the funny category of being a smuggler to be subversive, but it's based on poverty, it's based on special needs, it's based on somebody who is willing to buy the smuggling good, and beyond the metaphoric and symbolic representation, I'm curious on the concrete aspects, what might be the target of being a sniper, and what might be the target in this migration context, what is the smuggling content in the situation of being a migrating artist?
这个当然，如果一个社会富裕，然后就有移民，为什么？因为要防止偷盗，是吧？如果一个社会正在变穷，是吧？这个你要请移民都请不来，是吧？这个是一个，就像这个兰花跟那个黄蜂的关系是一体的，不，现在问题还不是穷跟富的问题，因为我们知道 一个富裕的国家，然后它有更多的自由，它里面更丰富，在里面的就是有更多的可能性。如果一个很穷的一个国家，可能性就缺少，而且这整个的社会都在改变，所以还不是艺术家需要迁移，而是社会需要迁移。但这个是个大目标，这不是几个人可以迁移，但历史就在迁移。
Okay, actually it's not the artist who has to move, but it's the whole society who needs to migrate. Because, I mean, it's always, when a person migrates, it's because he wants to leave a poor place, he wants to have a house, he wants to have all the possibilities, he wants to have all the affluence that another society can offer him. And in the new society, which is rich, he has freedom, he has a lot of possibilities, but that is only for a few people if it's artists. So actually, the one who should migrate is the whole society.
I guess this is exactly where we need some snipers, whether it's artists or intellectuals or people on the street protesting and so on, because the effort of the accident created by the snipers probably is the opportunity for the society to understand the necessity of self-transformation, or what he calls the migration itself, the migration of the society and the migration of the kind of consciousness of history change or historical change. So I guess, the snipers are people who actually hit on certain nerves, hurt a certain point of acupuncture that enact this possibility of migration.
然后这个我要说一下，就是说我这个冷枪手的这个概念，其实从德国人从这个卡尔史密斯这里来的，因为这个他提到了一个政治的概念，然后后来他也研究了游击队，就是从这个游击队里面我觉得这个里面是跟艺术家的现在状况是有很大的关系。
I just want to say, to clarify, that the idea of the sniper came from the German Karl Schmidt, and when he worked on politics, and he also worked on guerrilla tactics, and this is very much related, of course, to what the artist is doing.
Like guerrilla marketing. Sorry? Like guerrilla marketing. Let me go further. I made the list of these migrating people, and there were weapon dealers and ammunition sellers also. So they would say yes to your position to be a sniper because they can sell the ammunition and the weapons to you. So this would be a useful collaboration. So it must be more metaphorical, like people like Jean Genet or others who hit the nail in an unexpected moment. I think that's more metaphoric than concrete, because otherwise we will meet again in prison and do prison projects on artwork. There were some more questions.
I have a question for Huang Yongping. 刚才您提到恐怖分子和艺术家这两个概念，我想问您为什么把这两个人物或者是角色放在一起呢？据这个上海合作组织对恐怖主义或者恐怖分子的定义的有一个特别的地方和国际上不同，它就是说，有一个特别就是叫做民族分裂主义。他特别强调的这一点不同，和美国的这种国际上对恐怖主义的定义不同，所以我想问一下，您对这个文化的融合怎么看？或者说，或者说您的在这个艺术家的身份，在这种文化融合，还是说，比如说在现在这个德国这个曾经发生过种族主义的地方、种族屠杀的地方，我想特别谈一下这两个概念，您是怎么理解这个关系的？
Well, just to sum up, it's about the combination of terrorists and artists that he talked about, and the question is why he would combine these two roles. And like in the SEO, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we have different approaches, like there's a Minzu Fenli, division of nationalities, to break up separatism. And then there's also the U.S. approach to terrorists. And when we go into culture now, how do you see the role of the artist? And because in Germany we also have attempts at terrorist attacks, so maybe you could talk how you come to combine the terrorist and the artist, these two notions.
对，还有中国是一个多民族的一个背景的一个国家，所以跟德国历史上它有一些，它希望一个纯粹的民族这种历史背景上有一些不同。您是怎么看这两种社会发展的？
And it's also, of course, this has to do with German history, that Germany wanted to be a pure race in former times.
Who said that? Who said Germans pure race?
就是他们以前不是
extremely dangerous.
但是中国它号称是一个它是一个多民族的国家，就是什么时候号称的，你知道吗？
Because China is a multi-ethnic country.
对，我就想问一下，这整个一个社会或者文化这种政治，
我想这个问题就是我简单的说啊，作为我艺术家，我反对种族主义，我反对爱国主义，啊，这很简单，没有说什么原因，就这样，啊。
I mean, my answer is very easy. As an artist, I'm against racism. I'm against patriotism.
There's another question over here. In the middle. So microphone.
Yeah. Should I talk?
Hello.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I feel like I don't really know if I understand what you're really saying about artists as migrants and migration within the kind of art community, because as we know, it's still a difficult thing to be a migrant. In fact, tonight at the Brandenburg Gate, somebody has just been taken away as part of a protest of a migrant community not having rights here. And you yourself, Huang Yongping, talk about, I suppose in a way, the difficulty of integration, for example, with communication, with language barriers. And even here tonight, we're kind of speaking different languages and trying to understand each other. So I guess I'm wondering whether you see your migration as a positive thing, which is kind of making a more widely discursive practice and making your art wider, or whether somehow it could weaken the possibility of the intensity of meaning. And I know you talk about, well, as I understand, a lot of the meaning in your work is about the impossibility of meaning, but still perhaps maybe that would be stronger if you weren't a migrant. I don't know. Do you see are you a migrant out of choice and as a positive move, or out of necessity? And within the art community, is this necessarily the best thing?
这个是这样，因为我刚刚不是也说了，就是说我一直把 否认自己是个移民哈。这个因为我的情况也比较特别，我当时到法国的时候，我两个很小的行李，而且我一不懂英文，二不懂法文，是吧？而且这个都是托黄安如说我要买一张飞机票，要回去，要怎么的，都已经说好了啊。但是所有，我觉得移民是一件就偶然的事情啊。对，偶然性既不是一个很好的东西，也不是一个很坏的东西。
Well, I just want to say that maybe my situation was very special. I came to France with just 2 very small pieces of luggage because he told me just get a flight ticket and come there, and then.
I booked the ticket for him from Beijing back to Xiamen on his way back from France. He was supposed to go back to China after 3 months, after the exhibition in Pompidou.
And then, I mean, I don't know English. I didn't know English at the time. I didn't know French, so that I became a migrant, that I stayed in France was really very much by chance. And I just can't say it's neither good nor bad.
这个我是觉得因为每个艺术家的每个人的情况完全不一样啊，就没有一个例子是重复的，而且因为我这个人可能也善于，就是说不是善于，就是说我会狡辩嘛。但这个是坏事，狡辩就是一个事情是这样，这样就你搞不清楚。我觉得搞不清楚也好，就不要搞太清楚。
And I mean, every situation is different, and history never repeats. So, in my case, it just happened that way, and I just adjusted to it. So.
Yeah, I guess the notion of migration. It's not. There are many different levels of interpreting it. As Wolfgang just pointed out, there's so many categories of migration. We can talk about birds, for example. We can talk about human beings. We can talk about, and in medicine we can talk about all this. But at the end of the day, I think when we related art and migration together, I think there are multiple meanings, but they're all related. I guess number one is really an artist, by definition, is someone who expressed a different voice from the common. And so by definition, he has to migrate his position as a thinker, as a speaker, as someone who imagines the world in a different way. Right? And the second thing is actually related to a current geopolitical context that globalization brings not only circulation of money and people, but also a restructuring of thinking. And artists very often are at the frontier of this restructure process. I think this is extremely important to say migration, it's not simply about telling a painful story or lucky story of someone, but it's really about provoking other ways of thinking about the world, including the idea of globalization being something different from what we think as one kind of dominant system of being globalized. So on and so forth. So I guess that puts us, artists or any independent thinkers, in the position of migrant.
There's a potential. Yeah. There is one question over there. The note was by the hinterher.
Ja, ich habe auch noch eine Frage gerade. I have a question about. I want to touch again about the in-between, because as Hou Hanru before spoke about the space of interaction, and Wolfgang Knapp talked about this gap, which was kind of negatively connotated, like about the polarization of this of an exchange. And now, if we talk about globalization or more network, the in-between is getting much more complicated. And so my question is, because when we talk about migration and translation or transformation, this is kind of a movement from one, maybe a belonging to something, to a not belonging, or for belonging from different points or identities, and something in between. So this is this place of transformation. How can you localize, or how can you describe it? I mean, not localize in a geographical sense, but in your personal work and in your biography or identity. I mean, maybe from each of you, this would, yes. Interesting.
每个人都回答。这个就是因为之间，其实这个就是说，像所有的名词一样啊，我是所有的内容，比如说像艺术什么，都是没办法回答的。为什么？你说之间，我觉得我就认为说之间可能是个陷阱啊，是一个黑洞，是吧？因为两边不着边啊，这个各种各样，但是你总是所有东西都在围绕着这个东西啊，这东西在走。而且我们虽然在谈同样的事情，其实我们谈的都是不一样的东西，所以是很麻烦。
Well, I mean, this notion of in-between, it's something like art. It's something you cannot really, it's a thing you cannot really give an answer to. And maybe it's a trap. Maybe this notion of in-between is a trap, or it's a black hole. I mean, we keep going around it, and we encircle it, and in the end, maybe we are talking about totally different things.
First, I would only note that this aspect, what Hou Hanru already figured out, that migration is not the result of suffering or being fugitive or a push to be nomadic. Very often in this cultural context, it's a decision of an artist to migrate with all the consequences as a qualification strategy and as a self-forced challenge. What will happen to my artwork? And sometimes you realize you can migrate wherever. We have this debate on Robinsonade, you take your society with you. So it's not so easy to change. The hope that migration only will have a positive influence on your artwork is a one-way direction. So there should be more on this migration as a physical movement. The question is, how you can oscillate between these different levels and to find, like a monkey in a grid, the next grip to touch, which you don't know when you migrate. So you could see migration also as a self-irritation, as a self-challenge in artistic approaches to other subjects. If you are expelled, or if you are by political reason a displaced person, that's a different decision. I brought Turkish artists in the first military push in 1971 out of Turkey, the manuscripts. That's a different thing than this self-forced migration. Interesting is that I think this gap in between is a little bit too much romanticized, because the gap is also a given gap by society. And the question is, where can we find the gaps which are not already offered by society? If you look back to the debate on Horkheimer Adorno, cultural industry, when they say the talent is already part of the market before it is discovered, because he decided to be a part of the market to be discovered. So you are trapped in this situation. It's the same like the so-called, I don't know the translated word niche in English. Niche? Yeah, a niche. It's very nice if you and very, very romantic to look in a niche. But you are sitting in a niche and you look outside, you have a very narrow view. And this is very important to check what is the potential of this gap in between, beyond saying there is a gap in between. How are you acting in this gap? Who is giving you the permission to fulfill the gap? Who is trying to push you in the gap to prove pluralism? Say, look, and cultural attitudes are very often foreign policy of governments. Say, oh, look how democratic we are against artists. They can act in the gap. Look to the Iranian film policy. It's a strategy to say, oh, we pay you for fulfilling the gap. And perhaps sometimes we have to refuse to go to this territory and say, no, we stay on that side or that side. Don't support me by going to the gaps and to fulfill your strategy of foreign policy with cultural strategy and means. So it's a very ambivalent, and I'm still doubtful to this area. Sorry for this long comment.
Well, of course, the notion of the in-between has been somehow defined in a certain kind of particular terminology because of the movement of cultural studies and post-colonial theory and so on and so forth. But I think personally, I kind of adapt this notion in the sense that it's not simply related to the already very complicated stories that are described by people like Homi Baba and so on. But I guess it's much more related, as you said, to your personal kind of experiences. That I think it's an ongoing struggle to understand who you are by continuously inventing a kind of relatively imagined utopian space in which you try to test out the sense of your efforts. So that means there's a whole set of rejection related to that. For example, rejection of representation. I think I remember there's a wonderful title by Susan Sontag. It's called Against Interpretation, right? And representation, sorry. So when we talk about the photographic image, how can you imagine there's something that it's not representational? And being someone working as a curator in an exhibition, working as an exhibition organizer, closely related to institutions and so on, how can you produce projects that are not representational? And in the meantime, it continues to express this struggle for freedom. I think this is extremely important as a kind of positioning when I mentioned the in-between. And personally, I think, it's not very complicated. We grew up in a very interesting context, which is so-called China, but China, over time, it's never one China. It's always many, 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 many different cultures and diversities of things together, and also diversities of individuals. And these individuals also inside, there's a complexity of many things. So from there already, in terms of language, for example, Yongping and I sometimes have a lot of misunderstanding because of our different accents, talking in Chinese. Starting from there, we fight. So we need a kind of in-between space so this kind of fighting can happen and come up with a kind of mutual understanding without really understanding what we really want to say. So that means this space is related to the notion of freedom and justice. I think it's extremely boring to say that, but it's extremely important to remember that.
I just wanted to say what I thought what you formulated now really touched me, because it's kind of really utopian that every action or every what you are doing is kind of moving to an unknown. It's like kind of migrating. So it's you can like use it as a metaphor for thinking, acting. Yeah.
Feeling is that migration, this work is not very good for culture or art, because in the beginning the artists first, they are not without this financial interest in the beginning, and also like, for example, like from a former time like this, missionary people go over the world, give the message. So you don't call them migration. They are not migrating to another new land to give the message. Or like For example, from one time the missionary people, they go all over the world to give a message. But you not say that they are migration to the Africa, China, like the 16th century, or Christian missionary. They are not migration. They give message, give the voice to the new world. For example, the Pope in Italy, so you're not going to say he's migrated to Vatican to give his voice to the world.
So what's the question?
Yeah, I say that migration, this work should not into the culture. Culture itself doesn't exist, this migration, this work. And if
do you mean each culture has this kind of
like a
stability
culture exchange
of
exists in the world for many, many years. Since the human being culture exists, this culture exchange always exists.
Yes. So what was the real question? I still don't understand.
Question is like, for example, the artists. You call artists migrate to the new world, another country, but that is, I think, the purpose was not. In the beginning, I think they don't believe they're going to get some financial interest or all sort of interest through migration, but give it the voice of the culture understanding, the new voice.
Well, if I understand well, you mean artists should not be migrating for the sake of financial interest.
It's not my mean. I mean, it's in a culture world. Migration, this work does not exist. They always exchange through the culture to culture.
Well, we can take it as a statement.
It seems to be. Is this okay? I'm just in support here. It seems that he's saying that an artist like yourself, or artists who reach a certain level of become known, whether they migrate from China to France or to the US, is perhaps not so important, because the culture of art is not limited to one place. It's spread among different countries. And so if you choose to live in the US, is that really a cultural migration as an artist, or is it simply a choice of residency? I mean, you don't think that's relevant to the question of migration? I mean,
a real question. I mean, it's a very real question that.
Sorry.
It's part of reality, but on the other hand, I don't think this. It's how to say. It has to do with what we are talking about here, being a migrating intellectual, meaning that you evolve according to your experiences with of different locations and places and people that you encounter, right? That it's always been a very important motivation and driving force for your imagination and creativity. So in a way, whether the art world is globalized or not, but there's always certain kind of difference in each location, each place you go to, and that there's a necessity, or there's a kind of possibility, at least, to incite the artist to somehow question himself. So this questioning, it's a lot, has to do with the essence of what migration here means. Yeah.
What I want to say actually is like, the artist migrates to the new world or another country. Actually, the purpose is not because some interest of financial interest or whatever. It's for keep the voice, it's a special voice to similar like at the former time, this missionary people, Christian, go to Africa or go to China, give the new message to the new world, which the people over there didn't understand that message yet.
Of course, you know, when you're an artist, you have to believe in certain things. And you carry with this conviction, right? You carry your conviction with you when you travel around the world, whether you are going to settle somewhere else or nowhere else, or you stay home.
That's what I mean,
yeah, so I think it's really important. And then how to communicate this conviction, there are different ways. Sometimes can be extremely aggressive, that you might confuse that with what the missionary have been doing in the time of colonialization, right? But I don't think we are in the same context. And I think that the context of the art world, somehow it's a bit more sophisticated than the very violent colonization, I guess. But because we have a possibility, we have a necessity to question this mechanism of colonialism. Just like, you know, why we are sitting here in this building itself, this is a part of the art world. And I remember 15, 20 years ago, the first time I came here, I already posed a question about the name of this building, and still keeps the same name, because this is a very interesting Cold War product as a response. It's a Western response to exactly what we are seeing here, the year zero. When the moment that when the Bandung conference happened, when the movement of non-alliance happened, when there's another project possible to change the modern world, that the West actually come up with a kind of humanitarian answer to that, so they can somehow preserve certain kind of superior position. And by actually, very interestingly, excluding the possibility of the third space by naming a second space in the first space. When you really think about the name of the house, the Kultur und der Welt, meaning what? The house, it's not a museum, it's a house. It has a very specific connotation in the history of institution. And the Welt, and the Kultur, actually culture, also was somehow excluded from, differentiated from art and many other activities. When we talk about the other, we talk about the culture, we don't talk about the arts. So this is what, you know, Magistrat de la Terre actually seemed to be so radical, so provocative, because it included the other culture as art in the art context, right? And then the Welt, the word, actually, do you remember this notion called the world music? The world music meaning what? The African guys dancing with their, you know, drums and, you know, flute and things like that. It has nothing to do with Beethoven, right? It has even nothing to do with rock and roll. So that is a very interesting connotation being implied in the specific historical process. So and that means you're creating a second space in the first space to exclude this in-between possibilities. So this is why this building is still... So I found it really interesting that we have this exhibition here today that actually potentially deconstruct this building itself if that project was carried out. Unfortunately, it was somehow put it in a nostalgic mood rather than putting it back in the current situation to restructure that project.
It's lauter.
Now you can hear me. I think the relation between migration and art or contemporary art is a very interesting one. And actually, in art history in Germany right now, people are trying to use this notion of migration to rethink the discipline of art history. And I would like to suggest to maybe take on a historical perspective as well, to maybe look into concepts of migration historically in different art histories. And I'm thinking of this book by T.J. Damas, who wrote the Exile of Marcel Duchamp, I think that's the title, where he tries to conceptualize Marcel Duchamp's concepts in very close relations to Marcel Duchamp's life as an exile artist, saying that the displacement that also plays a crucial role in his artworks has to do with his existence in exile. I think that this, and I mean, if you think of Duchamp, this was like one of the paradigm changes in European art history. Also, thinking about institutional critique. This is just an idea. And then the Chinese word for immigrant still is Yimin, right? And I think this might also be quite interesting because Yimin in Chinese art history also plays a very important role. Maybe I'm wrong, but literary painters very often drew back when they weren't satisfied with politics or the government in order to rethink maybe also what they thought art could be. So this is just a comment.
这个因为刚才在翻译，所以整个是一个沉默空白。其实也是一个很好，就是我们来说明之间其实是很多的空白，很多的沉默，是吧？这个因为碰到的是一个各种各样的交流的困难啊，其中有语言，有什么。
Okay, there has just been silence and an empty space while I was translating, and this is maybe an interesting thing that while we are trying to dialogue and to exchange ideas, there is silence and there is like an empty space all of a sudden.
对，但我如果能够理解的话，就刚才为什么提到马赛杜香，因为可能是因为这个有很多说是因为受马赛杜香的影响，是吧？这个但是要清楚一点，我们知道波伊斯他曾经起来反对杜香，他说杜香的沉默被扩大。其实在我的这个字典里面，我经常有两个字典，啊，这两个字典呢是一个可能是互相矛盾的，这个就是来说明我们的之间。这个我觉得很重要。
I'm not. Could you help me?
Basically, what Yongping said is actually the idea of the silence was criticized also once by Beuys. He was commenting that the silence of Duchamp has been kept for too long time, for example. And this silence actually created the in-between space. But for him, being an artist, he always has two major references or supporting points. They're very often contradictory, one another. So he has to rely on this contradictory supporting points to exist. And this contradiction actually generates an in-between space. What in-between space actually very much meaning this space created in the tension between these two different supporting points.
It's quite interesting because he also gave some recommendations how to move. There's a text, I think it's pretty important but rather unknown, published in English by Duchamp in 1962 in the States, Why Artists Should Go to University. And he was talking about the bad peintre, the unskilled painter. And he said the world is so complex that academic education is not sufficient enough. So there might be another place where you have to move to. That might be the place of university. Okay, this is one place. So it's another point of self-challenge. The missionary, he has a good situation because he already knows what he will transport. There is a Trinity concept in Christian a monotheistic religion. There's a Jesus and there are some other people in this concept. And if you have a Muslim agitation concept, it's also clear what is included and excluded. The artist in this self-challenging concept I rely on, and I think this might be a reference to Duchamp in his isolated context. He reports in this period, especially when he had a show, he was asked during the show how he liked the show because nobody recognized his face. Imagine today, Baselitz is a show and somebody goes to Baselitz, do you like the show? Because nobody knows his face. Now we know the face earlier than the artwork. And that's quite interesting of this self-marketing moment. The point is, migration is not only a physical moment. You could migrate, we call it inner migration, if you go to isolate yourself, and it could be at the place. It must not be a capital city. It could be somewhere. And the question is, how could you establish this kind of temporarily self-referential self-reflective distance to the own work as a challenge to migrate in another discursive context in relation to your own artwork. And this is perhaps a moment he wanted to stress with the text, should artists go to university? If you take university to choose for another place temporarily as a self-developed experiment, with not, and that's the case of an experiment, you don't know how an experiment ends. And migration is the same a moment beyond the missionary aspect. You don't know how it ends. You don't know how long you stay normally, if you're integrated or not. Perhaps you are moving on. And historically, of course, there is a big difference between Gauguin going to the Caribbean, or others go to North Africa, or the Philhellenic movement going to Turkey and sitting at home in Paris, you know this, with turban and Turkish coffee, to feel like they were migrating, but they are sitting in Paris and they rent the costumes from a theater to feel in a Turkish context. So this is not the point of migration. The migration is the attitude, I repeat, sorry for boring you on that point, as a self-organized challenge, and to move your ass and your bones to elsewhere beyond art market only.
Okay, everything has an end, so let's migrate to somewhere else, but I think this conversation would continue even our life ends, but this migrating story would go on. Thank you. Hopefully.